The bitter December wind of 1874 cut across the Montana Territory like a blade, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke and burning lamp oil that clung to Celine Whitmore's torn blue dress. At 28, she had thought herself beyond the reach of true terror. But crouched now in the corner of this buffalo hide lodge, every muscle in her body screamed from her desperate escape through the Jensen barn's blazing roof. Her left shoulder throbbed where she had struck the frozen ground, and the rope burns around her throat felt like bands of molten iron. Outside hoofbeats thundered past through the Montana cold, their rhythm as relentless as her hammering heart. She pressed deeper into the shadows, knowing that Hugh Percival's men were scouring every homestead along Elk Fork Creek, hunting for the woman who had seen too much, who knew too much, who had dared to question the corrupt deputy sheriff's methods. The lodge flap rustled, and Celine's green eyes fixed on the entrance with desperate intensity. A man stepped inside, broad shoulders, dusted with fresh snow, long black hair tied back with leather strips, weathered by wind and sun. She recognized him immediately, Tokala, the Lakota scout, who sometimes worked for the territorial marshal, a man caught between two worlds and trusted by neither. At 32, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had survived by reading danger in every sound, every shifting shadow, every change in the prairie wind. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw stood pale against weathered copper skin as his dark eyes quickly assessed her injuries with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen violence and its aftermath too many times. She tried to scramble away, but her wounded shoulder betrayed her with a sharp stab of agony that left her gasping. "Peace," Tokala said softly, his English clear, though marked by the careful cadence of someone speaking a second language. He raised both hands, slowly palms forward, in the universal gesture of non-threat. "You are safe here for now." "Nowhere is safe," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke and terror. "Not from him. Not from what I've seen." Tokala knelt slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The buffalo robe had slipped from her shoulders, revealing the full scope of her ordeal, rope burns on her wrists, where she had struggled against her bonds. Fingernail scratches along her neck, dried blood darkening her torn sleeves like rust-colored accusations. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly, his tone carrying a gentleness that seemed at odds with the knife at his belt and the Winchester 1873 rifle leaning against the lodge wall. Celine studied his scarred face, searching for some hint of his true intentions. After 18 months of keeping Hugh Percival's books, of filing his correspondence, and witnessing his increasingly brazen land-grabbing schemes, she had learned to distrust anyone connected to territorial law enforcement. But there was something in this man's dark eyes, compassion, mixed with carefully controlled anger, that made her want to believe in the possibility of justice, even here, in this lawless corner of the frontier. "The Jensens," she whispered the words coming out in a rush. "Oliver and Carolina Jensen, Norwegian immigrants with a small homestead about 15 miles south of Buffalo Crossing. They have 3 children, the youngest barely walking. Percival claimed they owed back taxes they'd never heard of, taxes on assessments that were never made. And you were present because I worked for him. She touched her bruised throat reflexively. "I keep his books, handle his correspondence file, his legal papers. I can read and write, which makes me useful in a territory where half the population is illiterate. Yesterday morning, I was organizing his files when I discovered something I shouldn't have seen." The lodge entrance fluttered in the bitter December air, and both of them tensed. But it was only the prairie wind, carrying the metallic scent of approaching storm clouds, and the distant sound of men shouting orders. "What did you discover?" "A deed." made out to the Jensen family for their 160 acres filed supposedly 3 years ago when they first proved up their claim. But something was terribly wrong with it. The paper was too white, too clean, without the yellowing and wear you'd expect from a document that old. The ink looked fresh, almost wet, as if it had been written that very morning instead of being filed years earlier. Celine's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her natural intelligence overcoming her fear. When I started asking questions about the date discrepancies, about why their original filing couldn't be found in the territorial records, Percival silenced you. He tried to. When I persisted in my questions, he lost his temper completely. Called me a meddling woman who didn't understand her place. He had 2 of his men drag me to the Jensen barn, where he bound my hands with rope and poured lamp oil around the wooden walls. The memory made her shudder violently. He said it would look like a tragic accident, foolish Eastern woman smoking where she shouldn't, caught fire trying to steal grain for her horse. Tokala's expression hardened into something that might have frightened a lesser man. He had known Hugh Percival's reputation for corruption for 3 years now, ever since the deputy sheriff had used forged tax documents to steal 40 acres of prime bottom land from Tokala's cousin Chaske. But attempted murder to cover up fraud that crossed into territory even darker than he had imagined possible. How did you escape the fire? There was a hay chute in the loft ceiling used for loading feed down from the upper level. I managed to kick the wooden slats loose from inside, but by then the walls were already blazing, and the smoke was so thick I could barely breathe. She held up her palms, showing angry red blisters from grabbing heated metal. I fell through to the ground below, landed hard on my left shoulder. Then I ran into the night without knowing where to go or whom to trust. When I saw smoke rising from your chimney hole, you decided to trust a stranger. I decided to trust someone who wasn't actively trying to murder me. The sound of approaching horses grew louder and more distinct, moving with the methodical pace of a search party that intended to examine every structure, every possible hiding place. Tokala rose fluidly, positioning himself between Celine and the entrance. His hand rested casually on the stock of his Winchester 1873 rifle, not quite lifting the weapon, but making its availability unmistakably clear. He had noticed the boot prints circling his lodge in the snow outside. When he returned from his morning hunt, someone had been watching, waiting for his return, taking careful note of who might be offering shelter to fugitives. "Stay quiet and still," he told her softly. "Let me handle whatever comes next." 3 riders had dismounted just beyond the lodge, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold. Tokala could hear leather creaking as saddles settled, the soft metallic clink of spurs and bridle chains, the low murmur of men discussing their search strategy. Then, a familiar voice called out, roughened by whiskey and winter cold. "Morning, Tokala. Hope we're not disturbing your rest, but we're looking for someone who might have passed this way during the night." Tokala stepped outside, presenting himself as a man with nothing to conceal and no reason for concern. 3 men faced him across the frozen grass, all wearing deputy badges that gleamed dully in the gray morning light, all carrying the predatory look of men who genuinely enjoyed intimidating those weaker than themselves. "Morning, Carson," Tokala replied, recognizing the leader without enthusiasm. "Cold morning to be riding patrol? Cold night for someone to be running around the countryside, causing trouble." Deputy Carson responded, his pale eyes never leaving Tokala's face. "We're looking for a woman in a blue dress, brown hair, probably injured. She's wanted for arson and theft according to the warrant. Real dangerous, they say. Many tracks in the snow from yesterday's travel." Tokala said carefully, deliberately, making his English more halting and simple to play to their expectations of what an Indian should sound like. "Hard to say which ones are fresh, which ones are old business. This would have been around midnight or shortly after. Woman set fire to the Jensen homestead, tried to burn out that Norwegian family. Could have killed them all, including their 3 children. Carson's smile was thin and predatory, like a wolf contemplating wounded prey. Course, accidents happen when dangerous folks run around in the dark where they don't belong. Easy to mistake a fleeing criminal for a wolf or coyote, if you understand my meaning. The threat was unmistakable and deliberately crude. Easy to claim she had been shot while resisting arrest. Easy to bury the truth in an unmarked grave and let the December snows of Montana cover all evidence of their crimes. I keep watch for dangerous people always. Tokala said with studied simplicity, "If I see anything suspicious, anything that threatens good citizens." "You do that," Carson replied, touching his hat brim in a gesture that mocked courtesy while conveying contempt. "Oh, and Tokala, might be wise to stay close to your lodge for the next few days. Lot of dangerous folks running loose in the territory, and we wouldn't want you getting caught up in something that's not your proper concern." The warning was delivered with casual menace: stay out of white man's business, or share the woman's fate. The 3 deputies mounted their horses and rode north toward Buffalo Crossing. But Tokala waited several long minutes before returning to the lodge, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate they had left someone behind to watch. Inside, he found Celine sitting straighter despite her injuries, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and defiant anger that spoke well of her character. "They're going to kill me," she said with flat certainty. "Not arrest me, not put me on trial. Just kill me and claim I was shot resisting arrest." "Yes." Tokala agreed without hesitation or false comfort. "Unless we prevent them from doing so." "Well, you barely know me. Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" "I know enough about you already. I know someone tried to burn you alive for discovering the truth about forged documents. I know Hugh Percival has been stealing homesteads throughout this territory for years, using forged papers and corrupt judges to give his thefts the appearance of legality. He began gathering supplies methodically: ammunition, dried buffalo meat, his sacred medicine bundle wrapped in red cloth. And I know that sometimes good people must be willing to fight evil people, or evil wins everything that matters." Celine watched him work, noting the economy of his movements and the way he checked each item with the thoroughness of someone whose survival had often depended on such careful preparations. There was something both comforting and unsettling about his matter-of-fact approach to violence and danger. "Where can we possibly go? Percival has men stationed throughout the territory, and they know this country better than anyone, except perhaps the Indians themselves." "I know it better than they do," Tokala said with quiet confidence. "This is my land, my people's land, before it became their territory. Come. We have perhaps an hour before they realize you are here and return with more men and tracking dogs." The travois Tokala constructed was ingeniously simple: 2 straight pine poles lashed securely to his paint horse's sides, with buffalo hide stretched between them to form a crude but effective sled. It would keep Celine off the frozen ground while her shoulder healed, and the broad runners would distribute weight across snow and soft earth without leaving the deep tracks that individual footprints might create. "This contraption looks like it might fall apart at the first rough ground," she observed with nervous humor as he helped her onto the buffalo robe padding. "My people have used travois for traveling great distances for more than 1,000 years," he replied, securing the bindings with practiced hands. "They work well when properly constructed. Trust me." "I already am trusting you. That's what frightens me most." They followed deer paths and creek beds that would conceal their passage from casual observation routes that took advantage of natural cover and avoided the main trails where they might encounter other travelers. The paint horse moved with the steady mile-eating pace of an animal bred for long journeys across difficult terrain, and the travois tracked smoothly behind, despite the uneven ground and occasional obstacles. As they rode through the brightening December morning, Celine found herself studying the man who had risked everything to help her. Tokala moved with unconscious grace in the saddle, reading the landscape around them like a book written in a language she could barely comprehend. There was obvious strength in his lean frame, but also unexpected gentleness in the way he adjusted the buffalo robe around her shoulders when she shivered, or guided the horse around rougher ground to minimize the jarring to her injured shoulder. During a brief rest beside a frozen stream, she asked the question that had been troubling her since his immediate willingness to help. Why are you really doing this? Why risk everything for someone you've never met before? Tokala was quiet for a long moment, checking their back trail for signs of pursuit while considering his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and newer anger. Because 3 years ago, Hugh Percival used these same methods to steal my cousin's farm. Chaske had 40 acres of good bottom land along Willow Creek, with a cabin he built with his own hands and crops that fed his family through every winter. He was a good man, honest, trying to make a life for his wife and children in this territory. Tokala's jaw tightened visibly. Percival produced forged tax documents, claiming unpaid assessments that had never been levied, got a corrupt territorial judge to approve immediate seizure of the property for back taxes. What happened to your cousin's family? Homeless in the depths of January cold with nowhere to go and no money to start over. Chaske's youngest daughter, Mela, died of lung fever that winter in a refugee camp outside Billings. She was only 7 years old with her whole life ahead of her. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, despite the passage of time. I should have fought then, should have stood up to the corruption, instead of telling myself it wasn't my battle to fight. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. So am I. Sorry it took me this long to choose the right side to stop being a coward and start being the man my family deserved. They had covered perhaps 15 miles through increasingly wild country when Tokala heard the sound that made his blood run cold, the distant baying of hunting hounds carried on the winter wind. Not many, perhaps 4 or 5 animals, but enough to follow a scent trail that horses alone might miss entirely. Dogs, he said grimly, spurring his mount to a faster pace while trying not to jar Celine's injuries unnecessarily. Percival brought tracking hounds, professional ones from the sound. How much time do we have before they reach us? Not enough. And that's not the worst of our problems. He pointed to dust clouds rising on both their flanks, barely visible through the scattered pine trees. He's got mounted men moving to cut off our escape routes. More riders than I expected. This isn't just a local posse, it's a coordinated military operation. The chase that followed became a hellish test of endurance, cunning, and raw determination to survive. The hounds were specially bred for persistence, able to follow a scent trail for hours without tiring, their baying voices growing steadily closer despite every evasive maneuver Tokala attempted. Behind the dogs came at least a dozen mounted men, far more than he had anticipated, suggesting that Percival was taking no chances with potential witnesses to his criminal enterprises. They were forced to abandon the travois at Broken Creek, where the icy water might confuse the scent trail temporarily. Celine insisted she could ride despite her injured shoulder, and Tokala pulled her up behind him on the paint horse, feeling the tremor in her muscles that spoke of exhaustion and pain she was trying desperately to hide. "Hold tight to my belt with both hands," he instructed urgently. This is going to become very rough very quickly. For the next 4 hours, they rode through increasingly wild and broken country, low mesas cut by deep arroyos, dense forests of ponderosa pine that provided some concealment but also limited their options for maneuver. Always behind them came the sound of relentless pursuit, the baying of hounds and the thunder of hoofbeats, growing gradually closer despite their best efforts to maintain distance. "There," Tokala said finally, pointing toward a line of rust-colored limestone and sandstone cliffs that rose like ancient fortress walls from the prairie floor. The narrows of Bighorn Canyon. If we can reach the entrance before they surround us. But even as he spoke, riders appeared on both their flanks, Percival's men spreading out in a coordinated sweep designed to prevent any escape. The deputy had anticipated their likely route and positioned his forces accordingly, like a seasoned military commander conducting a campaign. A rifle cracked from their left, the bullet whining past close enough for Celine to feel its wind against her cheek. More shots followed in rapid succession as the range steadily decreased, forcing them to ride low over the horse's neck, while bullets kicked up dirt around them. The entrance to the canyon system. Tokala shouted over the thunder of hoofbeats and gunfire. If we can reach the narrows before they close the trap. They made it with perhaps seconds to spare, plunging into a gorge so narrow that the towering walls almost touched overhead, creating perpetual twilight even in the middle of the day. Behind them, frustrated shouts and curses echoed off the stone, as their pursuers realized they would have to dismount and continue the pursuit on foot through the treacherous passage. The canyon floor was a nightmare maze of loose rock and hidden crevices that could snap a horse's leg without warning. Flash floods over countless centuries had carved the stone into fantastic shapes and left behind a debris field of boulders and fallen slabs that required careful navigation. But it was their only sanctuary now, and Tokala guided the paint horse through the obstacles with the skill of someone who had ridden such country since boyhood. 2 miles into the labyrinth of stone passages, they reached a junction where 5 separate canyons converged like the fingers of a giant hand. Tokala chose the steepest route without hesitation, following a path that angled sharply upward toward what he hoped would be an exit onto the mesa above and open ground beyond. They were climbing a particularly treacherous section, where the path narrowed to barely the width of a single horse, when disaster struck without warning. The paint horse, exhausted from hours of hard travel, stepped on a piece of loose shale that shifted under his weight. The animal stumbled, scrambled desperately for footing on the steep slope, then went down hard with a sound like breaking bones that echoed off the canyon walls. Tokala and Celine were thrown clear of the falling horse, landing hard on the rocky ground. The faithful paint gelding that had carried them to safety lay motionless, his right foreleg bent at an impossible angle, with white bone protruding through torn hide. His leg is completely shattered. Celine said unnecessarily, her voice thick with grief for the brave animal that had given everything to save them. Tokala knelt beside the suffering horse, running gentle hands over the hopeless injury, while whispering words of gratitude in Lakota. The fracture was complete and devastating. There would be no healing from such damage, no possibility of recovery. "I'm sorry, old friend," he whispered, then drew his knife with steady hands and ended the animal's agony with one merciful stroke. "You carried us well and with honor." And they were on foot now in country, where a Montana winter could kill the unprepared in a single night of exposure. And behind them, echoing through the stone corridors, the baying of hounds grew steadily louder as Percival's men worked their way methodically through the canyon system. "This way," Tokala said grimly, shouldering his pack and rifle. "There's a place I know maybe 4 miles ahead through the high country. If we can reach it before they corner us." The climb out of the canyon system tested both of them far beyond what they had thought were their limits. Celine's injured shoulder made every handhold an exercise in agony, while Tokala carried the weight of their supplies and weapons up slopes that would have challenged a mountain goat. But desperation drove them upward, one agonizing step at a time, toward the promise of defensible ground. They reached the mesa rim just as the first hound appeared in the canyon below, its triumphant baying echoing off the stone walls with renewed excitement. Within minutes, the narrow space was filled with dogs and shouting men, their voices amplified and distorted by the acoustics. until it sounded like an army was pursuing them. "There," someone yelled from below, the words bouncing between the rock faces. "On the north rim, I can see them." Bullets immediately began sparking off the rocks around them, most fired from too great a distance for accuracy, but some passing uncomfortably close to their heads. Tokala grabbed Celine's hand and pulled her back from the exposed edge, seeking cover among the scattered boulders that dotted the mesa top. "We can't stay here," he said tersely, studying the terrain with a tactical eye. "Too exposed, no real cover, and they'll have men climbing up from multiple directions within the hour." But even as they retreated from the rim, more riders appeared along the mesa edges in both directions. Percival had anticipated this move as well, positioning mounted men to seal off every possible escape route, with the thoroughness of someone who had planned this operation carefully. "Look there," Celine said, pointing to a dark opening in the cliff face, perhaps 80 yards away. "A cave, if it's deep enough to provide real shelter." The entrance was across completely open ground that would expose them to rifle fire from multiple directions simultaneously. But it represented their only remaining option for survival. "When I say run, don't look back and don't hesitate," Tokala told her with fierce intensity. "No matter what happens behind you, no matter what you hear, get to that cave and get inside." They made the desperate dash in a shower of lead bullets, whining through the air like angry hornets, while Tokala's Winchester 1873 rifle returned fire to disrupt their enemy's aim. Celine ran with strength, born of pure terror and determination, her injured shoulder forgotten in the face of immediate mortal danger. A slug tugged at Tokala's buckskin shirt, another kicked up dust at his feet. But somehow they reached the cave mouth without taking a direct hit. The opening led to a natural chamber carved deep into the sandstone by centuries of wind and water erosion. It wasn't particularly large, but it was supremely defensible, only one way in that could be covered by a single rifleman, thick stone walls that would stop any bullet ever manufactured, and a commanding view of all possible approaches. "How much ammunition do you have remaining?" Celine asked, as they caught their breath in the blessed safety of solid rock walls. Tokala made a quick inventory of his cartridge belt and the spare ammunition in his pack. 38 rounds for the Winchester 1873 rifle, 15 for my Colt revolver. What about you?" She examined the small pistol he had given her back at his lodge, checking the cylinder methodically. 6 shots, assuming I don't waste any of them on poor marksmanship. Then we make every single shot count, and we pray that help arrives before we run out of ways to fight back. The first serious attack came within the hour, a frontal assault by 8 men who rushed the cave mouth with covering fire from riflemen positioned on the canyon rim above. It was a well-coordinated effort, the kind of military-style assault that might have succeeded against less prepared defenders. Tokala's first shot dropped the lead attacker at 40 yards, his Winchester 1873 rifle, speaking with the lethal authority of a man who had learned marksmanship in the harsh school of frontier survival. The second man made it significantly closer before Celine's borrowed pistol found its mark, her bullet taking him center mass and spinning him around like a child's toy. "Excellent shooting," Tokala said tersely, working the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Keep aiming for the center of the body, exactly like I showed you." The battle settled into a deadly rhythm of attack and counterattack, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing endlessly off the canyon walls, while gun smoke drifted through the confined space. Gradually, Tokala began to realize they were holding their defensive position better than he had dared hope. Percival's men were numerous and well-armed, but they were fighting uphill against defenders who had absolutely nowhere to retreat and every motivation to fight with desperate courage. As the December afternoon wore toward evening and the light began to fade, the assaults became less frequent and more cautious in their execution. Several of Percival's attackers had been hit, some seriously, and the others were growing increasingly reluctant to expose themselves to the withering crossfire from the cave mouth. "They're pulling back to regroup," Celine observed, watching the last of the attackers retreat to safer positions among the rocks. "What do you think they'll try next?" "Something more indirect but potentially more effective," Tokala replied grimly, pointing to men visible on the canyon rim who were carrying suspicious bundles. "Those look very much like dynamite charges to me. They're planning to blast us out of here, or bring down the cave ceiling and bury us alive. Either approach would solve their problem permanently." He was interrupted by a voice echoing up from the canyon floor, artificially amplified by what sounded like a military-speaking trumpet. "Tokala, Miss Whitmore. This is Deputy Sheriff Hugh Percival speaking." They pressed themselves against the cave wall, listening to their enemy's words bounce and echo off the surrounding stone with supernatural clarity. "You are completely surrounded and vastly outnumbered. I am authorized by territorial law to offer terms for your peaceful surrender." "What sort of terms are you proposing?" Tokala called back, buying time to think while studying the cave's interior for any possible escape route. "Safe conduct to Buffalo Crossing for proper legal proceedings under territorial jurisdiction. You have my word as a sworn officer of the territorial government that you will be treated according to law." Tokala and Celine exchanged meaningful glances. They both knew exactly what Hugh Percival's word was worth, less than nothing, backed by nothing except his willingness to commit murder to protect his criminal enterprises. "What about the Jensen family?" Celine shouted down to him. "Now where are Oliver and Carolina and their children? What has happened to them?" There was a significantly long pause before Percival answered, and when he did, his voice carried a note of barely controlled impatience. "They are safe and completely unharmed, provided you cooperate fully with lawful territorial authority." It was obviously another lie delivered without conviction. If the Norwegian immigrant family were truly safe and unharmed, Percival would have produced them immediately as proof of his good intentions and lawful behavior. "We require time to discuss your generous offer thoroughly." Tokala called back, continuing to buy precious minutes to examine their situation for any possible advantage. "You have exactly 1 hour to reach a decision." Percival's amplified voice carried unmistakable menace. "After that deadline passes, we settle this matter with dynamite and fire." As the deputy's threatening words faded into echo and silence, Tokala began exploring the back portions of their refuge more systematically. What had appeared from outside to be a simple cave proved to be the entrance to an extensive network of passages and chambers carved by underground streams over geological ages and extending deep into the heart of the mesa. "Follow me," he said to Celine, leading her into the darkness with one hand on the stone wall for guidance. "If there's another way out of this maze." They followed the main passage for what felt like miles, guided by the faint but unmistakable breath of moving air that suggested connection to the surface somewhere ahead. The tunnel system proved to be far more complex than either of them had imagined, with side passages branching off in multiple directions and chambers large enough to hide a cavalry troop. After nearly an hour of careful navigation through the underground labyrinth, they emerged from an opening so well concealed by brush and fallen rocks that it would be invisible to anyone not standing directly in front of it. They found themselves in a hidden canyon nearly 3 miles from their original position, completely invisible from the mesa above, where Percival's forces waited for their ultimatum to expire. By the time they worked their way carefully back to an observation point that offered a view of the main canyon, they could see Percival's men still watching the original cave mouth with patient determination, waiting for the deadline to pass so they could begin their demolition work. They have no idea we escaped. Celine whispered with the first hint of optimism she had felt in days. Not yet, they don't. But when that dynamite explodes and we don't come running out and surrender. Tokala studied the terrain around them with the calculating eye of someone planning their next tactical move. We need allies, and we need them quickly. Real allies who can fight effectively, not just sympathetic neighbors who mean well. What sort of allies did you have in mind? Men who have lost property to Percival's schemes, families who have been cheated and robbed but were afraid to act alone. If we can find them and convince them they're not isolated in their suffering. He was interrupted by a distant explosion that shook the ground beneath their feet and sent a flock of ravens screaming into the sky. Too late for stealth now. They just discovered we're no longer where they expected us to be. Angry shouts and curses echoed across the canyon system as Percival's men realized their quarry had somehow vanished from what should have been an inescapable trap. Soon, search parties would be scouring every possible escape route with renewed urgency and considerably less patience. Where can we find these potential allies you mentioned? Buffalo Crossing, despite the risks. There's a man named James Patterson, former sheriff, before Percival had him removed on trumped-up charges of corruption. If anyone is organizing resistance to Percival's reign of terror. But reaching Buffalo Crossing would mean crossing more than 30 miles of open country where they could be spotted by patrols or tracked by those persistent hounds. It was an enormous gamble, but remaining hidden in the wilderness would only delay the inevitable confrontation. As they prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary and venture back into mortal danger, Celine reached out and touched Tokala's arm with fingers that trembled slightly, despite her efforts at self-control. Before we go into what may be our final battle, she said softly, I need to tell you something important. These past few days, running with you, fighting beside you, depending on your strength and courage, it's shown me who I really am, underneath all the fear and uncertainty. Not just someone's employee or a widow trying to survive, but someone willing to risk everything for what's right and just. The honesty and vulnerability in her voice caught Tokala completely off guard. In the space of less than a week, this educated Eastern woman had somehow transformed from helpless victim to trusted ally to something far more complex and precious. Someone whose good opinion and continued survival had begun to matter to him in ways he was still discovering. You have more courage than you realize, he replied gently, covering her hand with his. The kind of bravery that doesn't come from having nothing left to lose, but from choosing to fight when fighting matters most, when other people's lives depend on your willingness to act. So do you, and that's what frightens me most. How much I've come to depend on your strength, your wisdom, your kindness towards someone you barely knew. She looked directly into his dark eyes without flinching. I've never felt this way about anyone, not even my late husband. Is that wrong of me? Feelings are neither right nor wrong. Tokala replied with gentle wisdom. They simply exist like the wind or the stars. The only question that matters is what we choose to do with those feelings. They kissed then there in the shadow of the red rock canyon, with the sound of their enemies searching frantically for them echoing in the distance. It wasn't the passionate embrace of romantic fiction, but something deeper and more meaningful. Two people acknowledging that they had found something precious and worth protecting in each other, something that made survival more than just avoiding death. When they finally separated, both were smiling despite the mortal danger that surrounded them on all sides. Come, Tokala said, shouldering his rifle with renewed determination. Let's go find some justice and some allies to help us achieve it. The journey toward Buffalo Crossing led them through country that seemed specifically designed by a malevolent deity to test human endurance and determination. They traveled primarily during the dark hours, navigating by stars that Tokala read like familiar signposts, sleeping during daylight in whatever shelter they could locate, abandoned line shacks, natural caves, dense thickets that would conceal them from casual observation. On their second night of travel, they encountered a young man leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He appeared to be in his early 20s with pleasant features and the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested recent arrival from more civilized eastern regions. "Evening, folks," he called out cheerfully as their paths crossed near a frozen stream. "Name's Thomas Miller. I work at Morrison's General Store in Buffalo Crossing. You folks look like you could use some hot coffee and a warm meal." Tokala studied the young man, carefully noting details that might be important in the quality of his clothing, the condition of his equipment, and the way he carried himself. Something about the encounter felt slightly wrong, though he couldn't immediately identify what was troubling him. "That's very kind of you," Celine replied cautiously. "We're just passing through the territory heading south toward Billings." "No, terrible, dangerous country to be traveling these days," Thomas said with apparent concern. "Lots of trouble with claim jumpers and such. Deputy Percival's got posses out hunting some real dangerous criminals who've been burning out honest homesteaders." "Is that so?" Tokala asked neutrally, his hand resting casually near his weapon. "Oh yes, very dangerous. A renegade Indian and a woman accomplice, from what I hear. Burned out the Jensen family just a few nights ago, could have killed their children." Thomas's eyes lingered on them with what might have been recognition. "You folks haven't seen anything suspicious in your travels, have you?" "Nothing unusual," Celine said quickly. "Just peaceful countryside and honest travelers like ourselves." They parted company after sharing coffee and brief conversation. But Tokala found himself looking back more than once as the young man continued on his way. There had been something in Thomas Miller's pale eyes, some quality of careful observation that reminded him uncomfortably of someone else, though he couldn't place the resemblance. Their third night brought them within sight of Buffalo Crossing, but the town looked wrong, somehow too quiet, too subdued, lacking the normal bustle of activity that should characterize a growing frontier settlement. "Martial law," Tokala observed from their concealment in a grove of bare cottonwoods. "Look at the patrol patterns, the way those armed men are positioned at key intersections. Those aren't regular town constables, they're Percival's deputies acting as an occupying force." They worked their way closer through back alleys and abandoned lots, carefully avoiding the systematic patrols that swept the main thoroughfares every hour with military precision. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears, and the town was under what amounted to military occupation, with armed guards at important buildings and a curfew that kept honest citizens locked in their homes after dark. "The church," Celine whispered, pointing to a modest wooden structure on the eastern edge of town. "If anyone is organizing resistance to Percival's rule, they would meet there." The basement of Buffalo Crossing's non-denominational church proved to be exactly what they had hoped to find. A gathering place for worried farmers and townspeople who had lost faith in official law enforcement. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on worried faces gathered around a table covered with hand-drawn maps and hastily written documents. But as they slipped inside through a rear entrance, Tokala noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Standing in the shadows, near the back wall, was the same young man they had encountered on the trail, Thomas Miller, from Morrison's General Store. "Tokala." A weathered man with graying beard and calloused hands rose from behind the planning table with obvious relief. "Thank the Lord Almighty, you're both alive and safe." Oliver Jensen, the Norwegian farmer, whose homestead had been burned in the attack that started this whole desperate flight, embraced Tokala like a long-lost brother, before turning to Celine with tears of gratitude in his honest eyes. "Miss Whitmore, we feared the worst when we heard about the fire and your disappearance. We thought perhaps Percival had succeeded in silencing you permanently. Carolina, your children?" Celine asked anxiously, her maternal instincts aroused by concern for the innocent. "Safe, thank God, hidden with my brother's family up in Glacier County until this nightmare ends." Oliver's expression darkened with anger and determination. "But it's been a close thing. Percival's men came for us the very night after you escaped, burned everything we couldn't carry on our backs. How many others have joined your resistance?" Tokala asked, studying the faces around the makeshift planning table while keeping one eye on Thomas Miller in the shadows. "More than you might expect," Oliver replied with grim satisfaction. "Word has spread about what really happened at our farm and others like it. People are finally beginning to understand that Percival's corruption threatens everyone who owns property in this territory. But we need concrete evidence," added another voice from the group. "Something that will convince territorial authorities in Helena to take decisive action." Celine reached carefully into her dress and extracted the corners she had torn from the forged deed in Percival's office during that terrifying night that seemed like years ago. "Will this help our cause?" Oliver examined the document fragment under the lamplight, his farmer's practical intelligence immediately grasping its significance. "It's a promising start, but probably not sufficient by itself. We need more substantial proof, original documents, multiple examples of forgery evidence of the larger conspiracy. I know exactly where Percival keeps his most incriminating files," Celine said with quiet determination. "A combination safe in his private office concealed behind a painting of General Grant. If we could somehow gain access to those documents." "The office is heavily guarded around the clock," Oliver warned grimly. "At least 2 armed deputies at all times, sometimes more. It would be virtual suicide to attempt such a break-in." "Not necessarily." Tokala mused, his tactical mind working through possibilities while he continued to monitor Thomas Miller's position. "If we could create a sufficient distraction to draw the guards away from their posts." "What sort of distraction did you have in mind?" Oliver asked. Tokala smiled with an expression that would have chilled his enemy's blood, and in that fierce grin was all the cunning of his warrior ancestors combined with hard-earned wisdom about white civilization's weaknesses and blind spots. The kind that brings federal authorities running to investigate faster than Percival, can destroy evidence or silence witnesses. The plan they developed over the next 3 hours was audaciously complex, requiring precise timing, considerable luck, and the coordinated efforts of several people who had never worked together in any kind of dangerous operation. But it was also exactly the kind of bold stroke that might succeed where conventional approaches had failed completely. The key element was Buffalo Crossing's telegraph office, which connected the isolated frontier town to the territorial capital in Helena and the wider world beyond Montana's borders. A small cavalry detachment was already bivouacked within 2 days' ride, awaiting orders from the U.S. Marshal in Helena. If they could get hard evidence of Percival's crimes into the hands of federal authorities, if they could prove his systematic corruption to judges who hadn't been bought or intimidated, the entire criminal conspiracy would collapse like a house built on sand. But first, they had to obtain that evidence from Percival's heavily guarded safe. The operation began at precisely midnight on December 23, 1874. When most of Percival's forces would be either asleep drunk or distracted by holiday celebrations. Tokala and Oliver Jensen approached the town jail from the rear, where several honest citizens were being held without formal charges on vague suspicions of seditious activities. The building was old and had been constructed more for intimidation than genuine security. It took Tokala less than 20 minutes to work one of the barred windows loose from its aging frame, creating an opening just large enough for a determined man to squeeze through. The prisoners inside were weak from poor food and harsh treatment, but their spirits lifted dramatically when they realized rescue had finally arrived. Most importantly for their plans, one of the captives was James Patterson, the town's former sheriff, who had been arrested when he courageously refused to cooperate with Percival's increasingly illegal demands. "How many men does Percival have at his immediate disposal here in town?" Tokala asked urgently as they helped Patterson through the window opening. "Perhaps 15 total, but they're spread throughout the territory maintaining control and hunting for you two. Maybe 6 or 8 here in Buffalo Crossing on any given night." Patterson's voice was hoarse from shouting unheard protests, but his mind remained sharp and focused. "The core group, the most dangerous ones, they stay close to Percival's office building for protection." "Where exactly is his private office located?" "Second floor of the brick building on Main Street, directly above Morrison's General Store. He's converted the back room into a private meeting space where he conducts his most sensitive and illegal business." While Tokala was liberating the prisoners, Celine was preparing for the most dangerous part of the entire operation. She had to get past Percival's guards, crack his combination safe, and escape with incriminating documents, all without being discovered and killed. She approached from the front of the building, affecting the manner of someone with legitimate business. The 2 guards stationed outside were engaged in quiet conversation, and their attention focused more on a bottle of whiskey than on their duty to protect the office. Moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there, Celine slipped past them and up the wooden stairs to the second floor. The office door was locked, but the window she had used during her previous escape was still slightly ajar. Percival's arrogance had led him to assume the particular security breach would never be attempted again. The office was dark and heavy with the smell of tobacco smoke and legal documents. She found the safe exactly where she remembered it, cunningly concealed behind the official portrait of General Grant. The combination lock looked formidably complex, but she was counting on Percival's vanity and predictability. Her first attempt used his birth date unsuccessful. Her second try was based on the date of his appointment as deputy sheriff, also unsuccessful. But her third attempt, using the date when Montana Territory had been officially established, clicked the tumblers into perfect alignment. Inside the safe was a treasure trove that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. Dozens of forged deeds bills of sale, with obviously altered dates, correspondence with corrupt territorial officials, and most damning of all, a leather-bound ledger documenting bribes, payoffs, and illegal land transfers going back more than 5 years. She was stuffing the most incriminating documents into a canvas satchel when she heard unmistakable sounds of trouble-heavy boots on the wooden stairs outside, more than one person moving with the confident stride of men who owned the building. There was no time to escape through the window and nowhere to hide except a storage closet near the back wall. She reached it just as the office door burst open, and 2 figures entered, not the guards who had been stationed outside, but Percival himself, accompanied by someone whose identity made her blood freeze in her veins. Thomas Miller, the helpful young man from Morrison's General Store who had shared coffee with them on the trail, stood beside the corrupt deputy with obvious familiarity and comfort. They should have returned with a report by now, Percival was saying to his companion with barely controlled irritation. I specifically ordered them to check in every 2 hours. Maybe they discovered something significant, Thomas suggested in a voice that carried none of the pleasant cheerfulness he had displayed during their trail encounter. A solid lead on the Indian and the woman. Perhaps. Or perhaps they've encountered the kind of trouble that requires immediate reinforcement. Percival moved to his desk with angry purpose, rifling through papers while his agitation visibly increased. Too many things have gone wrong in the past week. too many convenient coincidences and mysterious disappearances. He stopped abruptly, his attention caught by something that made Celine's heart nearly stop beating: several drops of lamp oil that had spilled when she lit a candle to see the safe combination clearly. "Someone has been in this office very recently," he said with deadly quiet, his voice taking on the dangerous edge of a predator that has detected prey. "How can you be certain, Father?" The word hit Celine like a physical blow. Thomas Miller wasn't just a Confederate or employee, he was Percival's son, planted among the resistance to gather intelligence and identify threats to their criminal empire. "This lamp oil is still wet. Whoever was here left within the past few minutes." Percival continued drawing his Colt revolver with practiced efficiency. "Search every inch of this room. They might still be hiding here." Celine pressed herself into the farthest corner of the storage closet, scarcely daring to breathe while her heart hammered against her ribs. The satchel full of evidence felt impossibly heavy, and every tiny sound seemed amplified to thunderous proportions in the confined space. Percival's footsteps approached the closet door with agonizing slowness, each boot heel striking the wooden floor like a countdown to her execution. "What's kept in this closet?" he asked his son. "Just old files and legal papers, nothing particularly valuable," Thomas replied, though there was something in his voice that suggested he suspected exactly what they might find. "When did you last conduct a complete inventory of the contents?" "Several months ago, at least. Maybe longer." The door handle began to turn with mechanical precision, and Celine could see Percival's shadow beneath the narrow gap. It was at that precise moment that a tremendous explosion shook the entire building, rattling windows in their frames, and sending both men stumbling toward the street-facing wall to investigate the source of the disturbance. "The grain warehouse," Thomas shouted, pointing at orange flames visible through the window glass. "The whole structure is completely engulfed. Get every available man down there immediately." Percival ordered, his voice tight with rage and the beginning of genuine fear. If that fire spreads to the surrounding buildings, half the business district could burn to the ground. They rushed from the office in apparent panic, leaving Celine alone with her racing pulse and the evidence that might finally destroy Percival's criminal empire. The explosion had been Oliver Jensen's signal. The Norwegian farmer and his volunteers had succeeded in creating exactly the distraction the plan required. She slipped from the closet and made her way to the predetermined window where a rope waited to carry her safely down to the alley, where Tokala waited with horses borrowed from sympathetic townspeople. "Did you get what we came for?" he asked tersely as she landed beside him, noting the heavy satchel in her arms. "Everything we need and more," she replied breathlessly. "Enough evidence to hang Percival and half his organization. But Tokala Thomas Miller, the young man who helped us on the trail, he's Percival's son. He's been spying on the resistance, reporting everything back to his father." Tokala's expression hardened as he absorbed this betrayal, but there was no time for extended discussion. "We'll deal with that problem later. Right now, we need to get this evidence to people who can act on it." The telegraph office represented their final objective, their last opportunity to contact federal authorities before Percival discovered the theft and took steps to silence them permanently. The night operator was a nervous young man named Williams, barely out of his teens and showing the strain of living under constant threat of violence. "I cannot send unauthorized messages," he protested when Oliver Jensen explained what they needed. "Deputy Percival has given very specific instructions about all communications leaving Buffalo Crossing." "Deputy Percival is a criminal and a murderer," Oliver replied with quiet steel in his voice. "You have a choice, son. Help us expose his crimes to proper authorities or become an accessory to everything he's done." Williams looked around at the grim, determined faces surrounding him, ordinary people who had been pushed far beyond their limits and were finally pushing back with everything they had. What exactly do you want me to transmit? The message they composed was concise, but utterly devastating, a detailed summary of Percival's criminal activities sent directly to the territorial marshal in Helena, with copies to the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal in Helena and the territorial governor. It included specific locations where additional evidence could be found, names of witnesses prepared to testify under oath, and an urgent request for immediate federal intervention. How long before we can expect some kind of response? Takala asked, as the telegraph key clicked out its vital message across hundreds of miles of copper wire. If they take it seriously and act quickly, 12 to 18 hours minimum. The territorial marshal has been looking for justification to investigate irregularities in this district for months. Williams replied, working the key with increasing confidence. As the crucial words traveled toward Helena and beyond, carrying news of their rebellion into the wider world of legitimate law enforcement, Celine felt something she hadn't experienced in many long months, genuine hope that justice might actually prevail, that their desperate struggle might achieve something more than just postponing the inevitable. But even as she allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic about their chances, she knew that the most dangerous phase of their fight still lay ahead. Outside the telegraph office, she could see armed figures moving through the smoke-filled streets with military precision. Not men fighting the grain warehouse fire, but professional gunmen conducting a systematic search for the people who had dared to challenge their employer's authority. "Percival knows exactly what we've accomplished," she said quietly to Takala. "It won't take him long to put the pieces together." "Then we'd better be prepared for his response," Takala replied, checking the load in his Winchester 1873 rifle with practiced efficiency. The final confrontation came 4 days later, on December 27, 1874, in the flat open ground just south of Buffalo Crossing, where there was no cover for anyone, and no room for deception, trickery, or strategic maneuvering. Hugh Percival arrived with every man he could muster from throughout his criminal organization, corrupt deputies, and hired gunfighters, intimidated officials, and desperate criminals who had thrown their fortunes in with his illegal enterprises. Perhaps 30 men in total, all heavily armed with modern weapons and prepared for total war. But they weren't facing helpless victims or isolated homesteaders anymore. Word of the telegraph message and the stolen evidence had spread throughout the territory like wildfire. And by dawn, a significant force had gathered to confront the corruption farmers and shopkeepers, ministers and mill workers, former prisoners and honest lawmen, all united by years of accumulated outrage and the hope that justice might finally be possible. The two forces faced each other across 100 yards of frozen grassland, as the winter sun climbed slowly above the eastern mountains, painting the confrontation in stark shades of gold and deep shadow. For several long minutes, neither side moved, both groups weighing the terrible consequences of what was about to happen. Hugh Percival broke the tense silence first, his voice artificially amplified by a military-speaking trumpet that made his words carry clearly across the battlefield. "You people have made the gravest possible mistake," he shouted with authority that no longer carried the weight it once had. "I am a duly appointed deputy sheriff of Montana Territory, and you are all in open rebellion against legitimate governmental authority. Disperse immediately and return to your homes, and I will show appropriate mercy." "The only mistake we made," Oliver Jensen called back, despite his bandaged shoulder, "was trusting you and your lies for far too long. You've systematically robbed our families," shouted another voice from the crowd of determined townspeople. "Stolen our land with forged papers and corrupt judges." "Where are all the families you've displaced?" demanded a third voice, that of Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher, whose husband had lost his farm to one of Percival's schemes. "What happened to all the honest people who dared to question your methods?" The accusations came from all directions, now a rising chorus of righteous anger that laid bare years of systematic corruption, intimidation, and abuse of power. Percival's face grew progressively redder with each challenge to his authority, until finally his carefully maintained facade of legitimacy cracked completely. "Enough of this rebellious nonsense," he screamed, drawing his Colt revolver with shaking hands. "I am the law in this territory. I decide who lives and who dies here." He fired deliberately into the crowd of civilians, and his bullet struck Sarah Mitchell in the upper arm, spinning the brave schoolteacher around and dropping her to the frozen ground. For one terrible heartbeat, there was complete stunned silence across the entire battlefield. Then both sides erupted into violence, with the fury of years of suppressed rage. But this wasn't the one-sided massacre that Percival had been confidently expecting. The townspeople and farmers had taken defensive positions behind wagons and buildings, and they were armed with hunting rifles and shotguns that proved devastatingly effective at close range. More importantly, they were fighting for their homes, their families, their children's futures, and their fundamental right to live free from tyranny. While Percival's men were motivated primarily by money and increasingly desperate fear. The battle raged with shocking intensity for nearly 45 minutes, filling the crisp morning air with dense gunpowder smoke and the continuous thunder of rifle fire. Gradually, it became unmistakably clear that Percival's forces were taking the worst of the exchange. Several of his hired guns were down, and motionless others were retreating to more defensible positions, and their coordinated assault was degenerating into desperate individual struggles for survival. In the midst of the chaos, Tokala found himself fighting side by side with Celine, both of them taking cover behind an overturned freight wagon, while bullets whined overhead like angry wasps. When a ricocheting shot grazed her left forearm, drawing a line of bright blood, he instinctively threw himself across her body to shield her from further harm. "Stay down and keep pressure on that wound," he said urgently, pressing his hand against the bleeding graze while continuing to watch for threats. "You've already lost too much blood over the past week." "It's nothing serious," she protested, trying to rise and return to the fight. "Just a scratch that looks worse than it is." "It's not nothing to me," he replied with startling intensity, and in that moment of brutal honesty, they both realized how much their relationship had deepened beyond mere alliance, beyond even friendship, into something that made each other's survival the most important thing in their respective worlds. The turning point in the battle came when James Patterson, the former sheriff, managed to work his way around Percival's left flank with 4 other determined men. Their surprise attack from an unexpected direction broke the back of the corrupt deputy's defensive line, sending his remaining followers fleeing in panic toward their horses, and whatever escape routes remained open. But the most dangerous moment was yet to come. Hugh Percival himself had been driven back to a cluster of large boulders near the edge of the battlefield, cut off from retreat and facing enemies on multiple sides. As Tokala approached for what appeared to be the final confrontation rifle ready, and justice within reach, a figure suddenly emerged from behind one of the rocks. Thomas Miller, no longer bothering to maintain his disguise of innocent helpfulness. "Father," the young man called out desperately. "This way, I have horses waiting." Thomas Percival, for that was clearly his real name, had been hiding among the very townspeople who opposed his father, gathering intelligence and waiting for the perfect moment to strike a decisive blow. Now he raised a concealed sawed-off shotgun with obvious intent to kill, aiming directly at Celine as she moved to help the wounded Sarah Mitchell. "For the family honor and everything we've built," Thomas shouted, his finger tightening on both triggers. But Tokala was already moving with the reflexes of someone who had lived his entire life on the edge of violent death. He threw himself between the shotgun and the woman he had grown to love more than his own existence. The double load of buckshot meant for Celine caught him full in the chest and shoulder, the massive impact lifting him completely off his feet and sending him crashing to the frozen ground in a spreading pool of crimson. Celine's scream of anguish and fury echoed across the battlefield, a sound of pure heartbreak that momentarily silenced even the gunfire. Thomas Percival, grinning with savage satisfaction, began to reload his weapon for a second shot that would finish what he had started. He never got the chance. Oliver Jensen's Spencer carbine spoke with final authority, the heavy bullet taking the young man's center mass and ending both his life and his family's legacy of corruption forever. "Stay with me," Celine whispered desperately, gathering Tokala's bleeding form in her arms while pressing her hands against the multiple wounds in his chest and shoulder. "Please don't leave me now. Stay with me." "Not planning to go anywhere," he managed weakly, though bright blood frothed on his lips with each labored breath. "Still have promises to keep to you." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, despite her own arm wound, worked frantically to save Tokala's life right there on the battlefield using techniques learned from years of frontier medicine. The shotgun blast had missed his heart by mere inches, but had punctured his right lung and severed several major blood vessels that would require immediate attention if he was to survive. "Will he live?" Celine asked through tears. She didn't bother to hide her hands covered with his blood as they improvised a stretcher from rifle barrels and winter coats. "If he wants to badly enough," Dr. Mitchell replied grimly, her professional assessment offering little comfort. "And if he has sufficient reason to fight for his life during the next few critical days." Tokala spent the following 2 months balanced on the knife's edge between life and death, his powerful constitution struggling to heal from wounds that would have killed most men outright. Celine never left his bedside during the worst of his crisis, reading to him from books borrowed from the church library, telling him detailed stories about the life they would build together when he recovered, singing half-remembered lullabies from her own Pennsylvania childhood. When he finally regained full consciousness in late February of 1875, weak but clearly going to survive, the first thing he saw was her face drawn with exhaustion and marked by worry, but radiant with relief and unconditional love. "Did we win everything we fought for?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "We won more than we dared hope for," she assured him, taking his hand with infinite gentleness. The territorial marshal arrived with federal troops 3 days after the battle. All of Percival's surviving accomplices are in custody awaiting trial in Helena. The forged documents have been exposed, the stolen land is being returned to its rightful owners, and completely honest officials have been appointed throughout the district. And what about us? What happens to us now? We're completely free and cleared of all charges. Official commendation for public service from the territorial government, along with a monetary reward for exposing the corruption. She smiled through happy tears that had been building for weeks. Marshal Patterson offered you a permanent position as a federal deputy. Good salary, real opportunity to make a lasting difference in law enforcement. Tokala was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the offer and everything it would mean for the future they might build together. "What do you want from life now?" he asked finally. "I want a life with you, whatever form that takes and wherever it leads us. Whether it means traveling between Indian country and white settlements, whether it means staying in one place or moving every few months as duty requires. I just want to be with you and build something meaningful together. Even if it sometimes means living between two worlds, never quite belonging fully to either one. Especially then, someone needs to build bridges between those worlds, and I can't think of anyone better qualified than us working together." Tokala accepted the marshal's position, and for the next 18 months he worked tirelessly to bring honest justice and effective law enforcement to the territorial frontier. But he also spent those months planning for a different kind of future, one that would include the remarkable woman who had stood beside him when death seemed certain and justice appeared impossible. When he finally returned to Buffalo Crossing permanently in the summer of 1876, it was to find that Celine had used money from the territorial reward and the sale of her late husband's property in Pennsylvania to purchase a small but fertile homestead just outside town. The cabin she had built with her own hands was modest, but well constructed with room for expansion and dreams of the children they both hoped to have. "Will you stay this time?" she asked as they stood together on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Montana prairie in shades of gold and deep crimson. "For as long as you'll have me," he replied without the slightest hesitation. "What about marriage, some kind of official ceremony to make it legal?" Tokala smiled and produced something he had been carrying with him for months, a beautifully beaded vest that incorporated symbolic elements from both Lakota and white American traditions, telling the visual story of their meeting, their shared struggles, and their deepening love. "Among my people," he explained gently, "when a man and woman choose to build a life together, they exchange gifts that represent their mutual commitment to each other's welfare. No preacher is required, no government papers need to be signed. Just the decision to share one lodge, to face all the seasons together, to stand as one against whatever challenges may come. And this vest is your gift to me. Actually, it represents my gift from you to me. What will you give me in return?" Celine disappeared into the cabin and returned carrying something wrapped in soft deer hide. When she unwrapped it with reverent care, Tokala saw a child's cradle exquisitely carved from local pine and painted with protective symbols drawn from both their cultural traditions. "My gift is the promise of our future together," she said, her voice thick with emotion and hope. "Children who will grow up free from fear and corruption, who will know both their heritages and be proud of both." They were united according to Lakota custom that very evening, as the first stars appeared in the darkening Montana sky. There was no formal ceremony conducted by outside authority, no legal documentation filed with territorial officials, just two people promising to love and protect each other through whatever years they might be granted. 6 months later, in March of 1877, Celine gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hope, who would grow up speaking both English and Lakota, with equal fluency, equally comfortable in both worlds that had produced her. 2 years after that came a son, Thomas, named not for any ancestor, but for the bright future they were all building together through love, determination, and mutual respect. Tokala continued his work as a federal deputy, but now he had something even more precious to protect, a family that represented the real possibility of peace and understanding between peoples who had been enemies for far too long. And in the evenings, when his official duties were completed and the children were safely asleep in their beds, he and Celine would sit together on their front porch and watch the stars emerge over the Great Plains, knowing that they had fought courageously for justice and won something even more valuable: the chance to build a future where love was stronger than hatred, where hope was more powerful than fear, and where two very different worlds could become one through the simple miracle of human understanding.